Hello, everyone. I'm Ramona Nadaf. I'm the director of the Art of Writing program at the Townsend Humanities Center, and I'm faculty in the rhetoric department. So welcome to the Morrison Library, which nobody is tearing down at the moment. Thankfully, one of the most beautiful rooms on campus. And today is Berkeley Writers at Work with one of my favorite people on campus, Glynda Hull. Let me tell you first about the Berkeley Writers at Work series. It began in 1997 as a forum for campus writers of note, of which there are many, to discuss their writing processes. Berkeley Writers at Work is different from the other forums we have on campus in that it focuses on how writers write as much as what they write. So today, we're lucky to have Glynda Hull, who's not busy at work with something she's changing about literacy in America, to be here with us. She's published more than 100 articles, chapters, and books on topics ranging from the teaching of writing, digital technologies and their uses in schools. And I really do believe Glynda was one of the first people really thinking deeply about multimodal and technologies in the classroom, adult literacy, and the changing context and requirements for work, community, school, and university partnerships. Her books include Changing Work, Changing Workers, Critical Perspectives on Language, Literacy, and Skills, The New Work Order, Education and Literacy in the New Capitalism, and Schools Out, Bringing Out-of-School Literacies with Classroom Practice. Her research focuses on improving K-12 education with an emphasis on literacy, language, and technology. And we know there's a new technology entering the classroom right now. A recipient of UC Berkeley's Distinguished Teaching Award, Professor Hull teaches undergraduate, graduate, and teacher education courses on literacy and media. In California, with support from the U.S. Department of Education and other agencies, Glynda Hull has created and studied after-school programs for K-12 youth that emphasizes digital media. So today, she is going to be interviewed from John Levine. I think many of you know John. He has a BA from Oberlin College and an MFA in creative writing from San Francisco State University. He's been the faculty of the college writing program at Berkeley since 1997 and has taught composition, creative writing, public speaking, and graduate pedagogy courses. He's a contributor to the book When Challenge Brings Change, How Teacher Breakthroughs Transform the Classroom from Columbia University Teachers College Press. And before becoming an educator, he worked in radio and television. An award-winning playwright, he's written, produced, and developed plays throughout the US and internationally. And I also just want to take one moment to thank all the faculty at College Writing Program who are tirelessly teaching our undergraduates right when they come to campus how to write, how to think about writing, how to be committed writers, and I don't think we give them enough recognition, so I just want to take one moment to recognize all of you who are here today, and thank you for all you do.
Hello, everyone. Can you tell I'm thrilled to be here? And I thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you, college writing programs. This is such a great honor, getting to take part in the Berkeley Writers at Work series. When I think about this series, I think first of the late, great Steve Tollefson, our colleague and beloved educator extraordinaire, who did so much on campus to improve the teaching of writing and to improve writing, including establishing this series many years ago and then leaving it to the best steward possible, John Levine. So thank you, Steve Tollefson. So I want to tell you I thought long and hard about what I should read today. I went back over my work, and I revisited pieces that I remember feeling especially compelled to write. You know, sometimes the desire to write a particular piece, it seems to kind of take on a will of its own, and the words will pour out onto the page or onto the screen, and they seem to be propelled by, emotion and conviction and the need to tell a story. So the excerpt that I'm going to read today is from such a piece. It's not one of my research or more technical publications, and it's not a new piece. It's a narrative from the heart, I'll call it that, written 20 years ago, in a different time and in a somewhat different world. So here's a little historical context for what I'll read. In 2005, a disaster struck the city of New Orleans, one that the city and the country and FEMA and all of the relief agencies were just woefully unprepared for. And that was Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was a level 5 hurricane, and the city of New Orleans might have survived it, except that the levees broke, those structures holding back Lake Pontchartrain on one side and the Mississippi River on the other. And eventually, 80% of the city was covered in 15 feet of water. The impact, it was devastating. It was especially devastating for the city's most vulnerable residents, the elderly and the poor, and the African-American population in districts like the city's 9th Ward. So the country and the world watched in horror from our television sets then at families clinging to rooftops and painting signs on those roofs saying, "Save me, we are here." We watched as people waded through the infested waters that filled the streets and pulled people behind them on makeshift rafts. We watched as thousands were crammed en masse in the most dehumanizing way into ill-suited evacuation centers like the Superdome. Unless you were politically blind, you had to see the racial divide that this tragedy laid bare and the way the burden fell on Black people. So, I had grown up in Mississippi, I can't believe it, in the 1950s and 1960s, a way long time ago. I'd grown up at a time when the racial divide between Blacks and whites was really blatant at this time and place. There was school segregation and voter suppression and violent intimidation. And when Katrina hit New Orleans, it reminded me of those days in Mississippi. And, I felt compelled to act in some small way. I remember that it was at the beginning of the semester. It was right at the end of August. And I just sent an email to my dean and said, "I'm going to go there. I've got to volunteer. I got to do something in this relief effort." And he wrote back a one-word reply: "Godspeed." And so it was that I soon arrived at the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, another enormous sports stadium where 25,000 people were being temporarily housed who had fled New Orleans and the water. So each day, as a Red Cross volunteer, I helped where I could, serving food, reconnecting people with lost family members, gleaning information that was in such short supply on transport and financial assistance and medical care, and trying to share it in what was a completely chaotic environment where the relief agencies were totally overwhelmed and understaffed, and people were desperate. They were sick, they were traumatized, they were separated from their families, they were missing their medications. There were all of these little indignities like, losing their reading glasses and, needing clothes and financial help and medical attention. So I did that during the day, and then in the evening, I wrote a record of that day, which I sent to a few friends back in Berkeley, including Steve Tollefson, who arranged for these dispatches to be published in the Berkeley News. So I call the series of 7 dispatches Dome Notes for the Astrodome, and I'll be reading a few excerpts from number 5 of the series, which was entitled Dishing Out Hope, and it focuses on the racial dynamics of volunteering. So here we go. Moods shift at the Dome within a day, from day to day, and for individuals throughout the day. I've learned to enjoy food service, especially breakfast, when there is hope that this can be a better day. At the Dome, I've learned how to be efficient in a food line, and also how to serve up a little good cheer. I staff food service for the elderly and disabled, along with Jerry, a fellow Red Cross volunteer from Indiana, and 2 walk-on volunteers from New Jersey, Bob and Marge. Not affiliated with any volunteer organization, Bob and Marge cashed in their frequent flyer miles for a ticket to Houston, rented a car, and found their way to the Astrodome. I can still hear their cheerful mantras in their distinctively Jersey accents. What'll it be today? I have grits, I have cereal, I have pigs in a blanket. And can I get you a donut too? What about you, sir? Water, juice? Ma'am, would you like a Fanta strawberry? What about an apple to go with that meal? My Jersey accent is lacking. But this example, of course, it trivializes what Bob and Marge really intended to serve up to those Dome residents. We're not just giving people food, they said. We're here to make them feel a little bit better. And as impossible as it seems, I saw them do it time and again across the vast cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, and racial gaps that separated most of the volunteers from the Dome residents. Bob would clown. He would tell corny jokes. He would find excuses to carry on a conversation with every person who appeared. I saw people look at him as if he were daft to begin with, but I also saw slow smiles appear. And gradually, more often than not, I saw him make a simple human connection. Jerry, the volunteer from Indiana, took every opportunity to do his juggling act to get a smile from a child who had requested or had been persuaded to receive a piece of fruit. Do you want the orange on the left, he'd ask, or the orange on the right, or the orange in the middle? And the kids would stand transfixed for just a moment as the fruit flew through the air, captivated by a performance being put on just for them. Indeed, most of the volunteers that I came in contact with seemed to care with a care that was more than care, to borrow a line from that old Edgar Allan Poe poem. One day, a Red Cross volunteer escorted to our food service area a little girl and her mother, a very tall woman dressed in gold lame trousers, an attire strangely incongruous with our dungeon-like surroundings. Dome residents, you see, were at the mercy of other people's closets. We learned that she had learned the day before that her father, the child's grandfather, had been swept away in the floodwater. And as we looked at them sitting on a bench across from us, a Red Cross volunteer plying the child with first this food item and then that, the striking woman in gold lame staring vacantly and stone-faced, Jerry, the volunteer from Indiana, began to cry. Seeing them, it just got to me, he explained without embarrassment. I've seen more tears on men's faces during my week stay here at the Dome than I've seen in my entire lifetime. The immensity of the tragedy and the toll on individuals' lives, and the desire to, in some small way, ease the anguish, gets to volunteers at unpredictable moments. One of those moments for me came when I spoke with a group of 6 Red Cross volunteers from Guadalajara, Mexico, early one morning as we rode the light rail from downtown Houston, where we were staying, to the Astrodome. I was sitting next to an older woman on the train, and as she got up from for her stop, I saw her tug at the shirt of one of the young men and say to him, "Gracias," nodding her head affirmatively. As he turned to look at her, "De nada," he answered, smiling. I learned that this unit from Guadalajara was an elite force from a famous Red Cross chapter where other Latin American countries send their volunteers to be trained. I also thanked this young man, and as I got up to go, he turned to me and he had parting words. He said, "This will change your life. You won't be the same now after Katrina." So I wondered whether he was addressing me personally or America in general, or maybe both. Will our lives in this country indeed be changed? I asked myself. Will this disaster set in motion a socio-political transformation powered by the shockwave that was sent around the nation when those pictures of the New Orleans poor herded into the Superdome made visible the legacies of racism and classism in this country for all the world to see? It is an odd thing to look about the Astrodome and view a sea of black faces and then notice dotted among them a crew of Red Cross volunteers who are predominantly white. I've become friends with Clyde, a Red Cross volunteer from Sacramento, a retired postal worker, a former military man, and one of only a handful of African American volunteers here. I asked him what he thought that all of these many African American evacuees thought about all of these white folks who were here attempting to minister to them. Odd, he said. And he added, and they probably think it's about time. I've also become friends with Barbara, a nurse from Berkeley. We haven't had much time to talk, even though we're roommates, because we're on different shifts and don't see each other for days on end. But a couple of nights ago, I stayed up late to write my postings, and I was awake when she returned at 12 a.m., and we talked into the wee hours, comparing our experiences, including our perceptions of racial dynamics. She said she knew that many evacuees sensed and appreciated the compassion of the white volunteers, but she said she also knew there was suspicion and distrust. She had noticed that when she was walking with a group of white volunteers, the evacuees invariably came up to her to ask questions because I looked like them, she simply put it, and they are therefore more comfortable with me. Many people asked me what they could do to help the residents of the Dome and other evacuees of the Katrina tragedy, given what I saw firsthand. I can think of no more important way to help at home than to make it possible for more African Americans to volunteer in this disaster, to be free to leave families and jobs, to spend time at shelters as relief workers for the hurricane survivors. But the racial dynamics among the volunteers and evacuees was not simple, and at times everybody fell short. One morning I overheard a news service worker chastise a Dome resident who wanted extra food. "Give me some more grits," the resident demanded. "Brother, don't you know other people have got to eat too?" The fragile mood in the breakfast line was broken, and the regulars sent the volunteers resentful looks, the contours of their faces remolding themselves in an instant. Last night I read a piece written by Cornel West, circulated on the internet, about the hurricane and its racially patterned impact. At the end of it, he said we shouldn't confuse charity with justice. And I've been thinking a lot about that, figuring the food, shelter, and the volunteer helpers that the Red Cross traditionally provides, it's in the charity column. And I wondered whether there will be any real justice around issues of race and poverty in my lifetime. I believe that most of the volunteers at the Dome were able to dispense a positive level of compassion and advice and practical help, and that these assuaged both the evacuees' needs and the volunteers' need to do something to help. The evacuees and the volunteers were nonetheless at the mercy of the bureaucracy in which they served or were being served, and the inefficiency and sometimes the inhumanity that we witnessed and experienced day in and day out. It feels like we are all at the mercy of the larger political, socioeconomic, and racial structuring of our country. And of course, the vulnerable are impacted a lot more than the rest. So, to return to the language of the Red Cross volunteer from Guadalajara, is it possible that our society will be changed for the better by Katrina? Changed in any lasting and far-reaching way by this catastrophe and the relief effort, both of which lay bare the racial and economic fracturing of our country? Thank you.
There we go. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, my mic is working. Thank you, Glynda. Thank you for sharing that piece. Thank you for coming to be this year's Berkeley Writer at Work. Thank you so much. It's so great to have you. And thanks to the Morrison Library for once again hosting this event. We have been doing this for 28 years now. 1997 was the first one. And it's just been delightful to be here. And it's so great to see so many college writing students and other people as well. In reviewing the series, and a shout out to the college writing program staff for compiling all of the videos, we do have an archive of just about every Berkeley Writers at Work on our website. And in reviewing it, we went back to the 1997, the very first one that Steve Tollefson started, and Glynda was what introduced the event. And she said, as part of her opening remarks, this was not planned, she said, "I'm so happy to see so many college writing 1A students." This was before we put the R in the class. So the tradition continues, the tradition endures, and it's so good to see so many people here. So the way that this is going to work is Glynda and I will talk for about 45 minutes. And as Ramona said, this is really about her process. And we found sometimes writers haven't thought about their process. So I may put you on the spot, Glynda,
Okay.
Just to talk about your writing process, because so many of our students are wrestling with their process, as am I. I think that's what I wanted to say. So also in that 1997 interview, Steve Tollefson's first question to Robin Lakoff was, do you write in longhand? Do you write on a typewriter? Or do you use this thing called a computer? That's where we were then in terms of technology. Well, needless to say, technology is still with us, with a vengeance, and we are all contending with AI. So, Glynda, first question right out of the gate is, what is your position on AI and writing? We're looking for answers.
I knew I was going to get this question. And I'm a little daunted that we have 45 minutes to answer it. I do have a position on AI and writing. Some ways I kind of feel like I'm the last of the Mohicans, because I can remember writing with a typewriter and, of course, in longhand. And I remember when word processing was a big thing. So I've lived through all of these technologies, and I'm really actually very optimistic about the use of technology in writing. Very optimistic. And that kind of comes from being a student of literacy and knowing that to write is to be engaged with technology. The alphabet is a technology. A script system is a technology. Papyrus is a technology. The printing press is a technology. Our computers, our screens now are technologies that are, so important for writing. But now we've got this new thing, the large language models and ChatGPT, and all of a sudden we're worried that it's not just a regular technology anymore. It's somehow more than a technology. It's going to take away this thing that we have nurtured over centuries and centuries, this ability to extend ourselves, to extend our own humanity by expressing ourselves using technologies. Yeah. So on the one hand, I'm really, I'm optimistic. I think ChatGPT and all of the large language models, I think they're just one more technology, and it's going to be up to us and folks who teach in college writing and the art of writing classes to not be written by the technology, but to learn how to press it into service for our student writers. The thing that worries me the most about it is that it might take away from our students this wonderful gift of learning how to use the word as a technology, learning what it means, to write something that's powerful, that comes from you, that comes from your heart, that comes from your mind, to craft sentences, to use images, to put meaning into the world and to see the little bit of a ripple effect that it has. Everybody needs to experience that. And UC Berkeley undergraduates who are here in the audience, do not graduate from UC Berkeley until you have that experience, till you know what it feels like to write in this way. Sure, use ChatGPT, use it. Use it for your outlines and don't be guilty about it. Use it in ways that are useful to you, but do not let it steal from you the power of engaging with language, of learning your own mind, of crafting an argument, again, of using your voice, putting it out in the world, not the assemblage of voices that is ChatGPT, but your voice, to make a difference in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. In my experience, that's what most of our students say. They still want to be able to speak their own voice, their own ideas, and that's the important thing. And it heartens me as well, so I'm glad to hear that. Ramona mentioned some of the books you've written, some of the titles, and I've gone through the hundreds of journal articles. I haven't read every single one, but I did go through a lot of them. And some of them are the journal articles, Current Views of Error in Editing, Hearing Other Voices, A Critical Assessment of Popular Views on Literacy and Work, Anthropology with Activism, Settling Its Value. But what I want to ask you about is on a number of these articles and a number of books, you collaborate with other writers, notably with the late Mike Rose from UCLA. Yeah. You had quite a partnership with him. So what is the process of collaborating, and how is that different from writing by yourself? Is there a different process?
Oh, what a super question. And let me just put in a plug for collaboration, because I think sometimes when we come to the university, we're told that we're supposed to write by ourselves, and we imagine coming to a carrel, or we used to in a library, and sweating out the blood on the page by ourselves. But if there's one thing I've learned about writing over the years, it's the joy of doing it with someone. And there's this special pleasure when the person that you're writing with is who can complete your sentences. You start one and that person can complete them. And when that's the case, it's just this magical moment. You mentioned Mike Rose, and the late great Mike Rose, and I can still remember sitting with him. He didn't speak about technologies. He wrote on a tablet for all of his life, but I can remember sitting with him in front of a computer and composing together with him. And the three pieces that we did together, we literally sat side by side and wrote side by side. Yeah? And that's magical. Wow, that's magical. It's not always like that, of course, when you are collaborating. Sometimes it's kind of just divide and conquer, and half of the piece sounds like you and half of the piece sounds like somebody else. That's not ideal. But when you can meld your mind with someone else and craft these sentences that you can't really remember who wrote which part, it's somehow, it's magnifying your own intellect, and it's a great pleasure. One thing that I kind of committed to do pretty early on in my career was was to write with my graduate students, and haven't always succeeded in getting them to write with me, but I've still got that ambition. And I think that when you learn to write with someone, when you have a mentor who teaches you to write, who's kind of side by side, I think it's one of the best ways to learn. It's just such a good practice for inculcating, values of the aesthetic values of writing, but also the intellectual process. And also it's a good way to reveal what's difficult about it, because everybody needs to know that too. It's hard.
Do you have a tried and true method? Do you sit and talk first with your collaborator or collaborators? Do you brainstorm together? Do you, as you said, divide it up and then come back and talk about it? Is there one way to do it, or are there many different ways?
Well, here's the classic answer. It depends. It just depends. And there are as many ways to collaborate in writing as I've had collaborators. And you find what works in a particular situation. If you have someone who's a pretty inexperienced writer, then the best thing to do is to take the lead in the process, and and especially to write the beginning. I don't know about you, but beginnings are hard for me to write. Yeah, they're really difficult, but endings are worse. Having a good ending on a paper. So I often kind of decide I'll try to do the beginning, and I'll try to do the ending, and then we'll figure out how to divvy up the pieces in between. But there isn't one good way to collaborate. It depends on who you are as a writer at the moment and the writer that you're working with.
Do you encourage your students to write collaboratively? Is that part in your teaching? Is that something that you try to nurture?
Absolutely. I do encourage that. And with my graduate students, they have a lot of joint publications. And there's just something pretty wonderful about being able to commit your words to page in collaboration with someone else and to see it appear in print. But I think, and I provide opportunities as well for my undergraduates to collaborate. There's a little bit of resistance, though, sometimes, because I think there is this belief that we're supposed to write alone, and when we don't, it's cheating. And there's also the worry that, I won't get credit for my ideas. But, gee, there's so many ideas to go around. It's not a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that writing can be really lonely, and it doesn't have to be. I mean, writing is a lonely practice, and I think that some of us think, I have to do it all by myself and sweat bullets, but you don't. And as you said, I mean, the sum is greater than the parts. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So I want to dive in a little bit into you as a writer, whether it's by yourself or collaboratively. Where do you write? Do you have a place that you go to write?
There's this cafe down on Telegraph. I like to write in cafes. I like to write, actually, in a public place. Do you? Do you also? I'm not sure why exactly, but there's something about being surrounded with people, even if you're not talking to them, that makes the process a little more animated and less lonely and a part of the world. I don't like to think about writing as being separated from the world. I like to think about writing as linking a writer to the world. So writing in a public place is something that I enjoy. But then I also, I write at my kitchen table. I have spots. I never write, now that I'm thinking about it, I never write in my office. Go figure, I never do that. And you're making me think, John, you know what, if I went down my resume, now don't ask me to do this, but if I went down those pieces and looked at them, I bet I could remember for a large number of them where I was when I did the writing, the table I was sitting at and what the weather was like outside and so on. And it makes me want to muse about, the importance of place and situatedness and also embodiment in writing, feeling yourself in a setting, feeling yourself connected to that setting, and letting that support the ideas to flow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I like to write in public places too, and I do remember where I wrote specific plays. And sometimes I'll try to go back to that place because that's where lightning struck. Doesn't always
Doesn't
work.
work.
No, it doesn't work, but it's worth a try. Is there a particular time of day that you write or that you find is the best time to write?
Just not early morning. I am not an early morning person. I find I have trouble doing most things early in the morning. However, I can stay up all night long, and often do. I love to write in the late evening, actually, and especially when things are difficult in writing. I like to tackle them in an evening time when, I don't know, it's sort of contradictory because I like being in public to write, but I also like being in kind of a cocoon where no one can reach me and I can figure out this problem all by myself. I know if I stay up late enough, I will write that paragraph.
Well, that brings me to the question, do you turn off all notifications? Is email off or text off while you're writing?
Oh, totally not. Totally not. I am a techie. I've got my phone right here. I've got my email on the other side of my screen. I've got Instagram. I have all of these things, beckoning to me, and I love having all that there. I think it helps with the loneliness, but it makes me feel connected somehow. But I don't want anything turned off.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you don't find it's a distraction? Do you use it as a reward? If you've written a paragraph, you can go check your Instagram?
If the truth be told, I like being distracted. And it helps my writing process to be distracted sometimes. It helps it. Yeah?
Okay, all right. Well, that's good to hear. Okay, good. What are there overall ideal conditions if you could set, if that cafe is the place that you write, does the lighting have to be a certain way? Does it have to be cloudy? Does it have to be sunny? Are there ideal conditions? If you could say, okay, today I'm going to write, here's what I need.
Well, like a day like today. I like sunny weather. I don't like it when it's gloomy in Berkeley, and I feel much more able to commit myself to a project when, I don't know, my emotions are up and I feel happy and I feel somehow, and this is difficult these days, that all's right with the world. Yeah, that helps me write. Yeah, but I think if I were pressed, I actually think I could write almost anywhere. Do you all feel that way? I mean, I feel like if I had to, I could write on one of those dark days, and I could write, I do write on airplanes and so forth. I think I could write almost anywhere. And I think part of learning to write is kind of cultivating the habits of mind that allow you to do that. Kind of no matter where you are, is to kind of put on your writer's self and almost feel in your body that the time has come.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. Well, you wrote your dispatches from Houston
Yes.
in your hotel room at night, I'm
Yes,
guessing?
yes.
And was that an issue? You had a roommate. Was that tough to carve out a space? Could you just curl up and just start writing?
Yeah, it wasn't tough at all. And as I was saying kind of in my introduction, I felt this great compulsion to write. And I could not wait, to pick up my computer and begin to try to make sense of the day. So I can still see, I can still remember riding on the light rail back to my hotel and going immediately there and, sitting in one of those nondescript hotel rooms and getting lost in recalling what had happened during the day and trying to kind of make sense of it. So, I mean, that's the best example, actually, I can think of being able to write anywhere. Yeah.
I know this is subjective, but do you consider yourself a fast writer or a slow writer?
I'm fast and slow, it depends on the piece, and sometimes the words really come out, and I have found that at those moments when words really flow and you start a paper and it almost writes itself, there's something that always feels so right about that text, and the times that I have to struggle and I go back to a sentence and I redo it and I redo it and I redo it, and those times are the most frequent. I'm usually having to work through an idea that I don't quite have yet, and that's part of the process too. But when I'm able to just flow, it's the ideas are there, and it's a matter of committing the words and getting out of the way of the words in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that struggle, would you call that writer's block? And a lot of my students have confessed that they have experienced that, and I can't really explain what writer's block is. So as I asked about your position on AI, what's your position on writer's block?
Well, I think I have a form of writer's block if procrastination counts. I put off writing a lot. I confess I put it off. I'll have a deadline and I know it's coming up, and I've unfortunately learned to rely on the pressure of a deadline in order to get me to start on a project. And I think that's a kind of writer's block. But I've learned to kind of frame it more positively. And now what I think when I'm procrastinating and I'm sitting in the cafe, or I'm walking around my place late at night and doing this and doing that, what I think of it as is part of my writing process, And I'm really serious there because I'm thinking about the ideas. I'm trying out a word. I know that there's a certain amount of angst, truly angst, that's going to accompany almost any piece that I write that's a serious piece that I care about. So I've come to expect it, not to treat it as writer's block, but to know that I've developed the rituals and habits to get through it, and that eventually, I trust that I'm going to be able to write. And that's another thing I wish for you all. I wish for every student and every writer in the room is to develop your process to the extent that when it feels so awful and when you have writer's block, that you have this bag of strategies that help you keep going, and you have the knowledge and the confidence that you will be able to finish the piece. And you will like some of those sentences that you wrote.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think we all have our own process, and we have to figure out what our process is. Yeah. Can you help your students find their process? What's the process of finding your process?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to finding your process is knowing that there's more than one, and not letting yourself get stuck because you're trying to find just the right one. One common problem that writers have is the first sentence syndrome. I actually like to polish the first sentence, but I see writers getting stuck all the time, student writers trying to write that first perfect sentence. Sometimes that's a good thing to do. It may be the way that you use for framing your ideas in a whole piece, but that doesn't work for everybody. And what you'll want to do is figure out what works for you. But not only that, what works for you in different situations. When you have a piece that's due in a college writing class, it's going to be different from a sociology paper. It's going to be different from a deadline you have at the Daily Cal. And what I think a writer does over time is develop a repertoire of practices that you can draw on in different circumstances, so that you're not stuck, doing the same one thing or attempting the same one thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And along those lines about your process, how long do you write? Do you write in one sitting? I suspect you're going to tell me it depends, but I'm going to ask it anyway. As part of your process, have you found that, okay, I'm good for an hour and then I need a break, I need to get up and do something?
No, it's a great question, John, and I have an answer for it. I write until a piece is done, not the whole piece, but a section is done, or maybe it's a paragraph, or maybe it's a sentence. But there's something that I'm working toward. I have this goal that I perhaps can't articulate, but I know I want to get this, I want to work through this idea. And that may be a paragraph, or it may be a page, or it may be just a few sentences. But when I reach that point, and when I do that paragraph, I take a break, I get up, I do something else. I sort of reward myself, and sometimes I go to an entirely different activity, but then that refreshes me, and I'm able to come back and kind of pick up where I was. If I get interrupted, I'm not able to finish that chunk, then I find it very difficult to start again, because there's not a finishedness to the piece that I had already done that allows me to go forward.
Do you ever work on more than one project at a time? And the reason I ask that question is many of our students, especially in the humanities, have 4 papers due in 1 week. Any advice there from your own experience, or what could you tell students about that?
Well, I think we need to rethink our curriculum in the humanities. I think it's really difficult to work on more than one piece at a time. At least it is for me. I know, though, that that's a requirement of being in the university, and it's a great skill to have, to learn how to manage more than one piece at a time. But ideally, as a writer, I'm able to focus my time and energy and just my commitment to one big writing project, one important one. So here's what I'd say. I'm working on many, many pieces at the same time, but not all of them are important to me. Not all of them have the same importance at all. If I can find one piece that's really important to focus my energies on, that works for me. And then I can do these others on the side. But to have multiple projects where you care deeply about all of them, for me, it's virtually impossible. Yeah.
Okay. Do you always write on computer? Do you ever write in longhand, whether it's taking notes or actually writing a piece, your composition process?
I have a funny story about that. I actually remember when word processors first were invented, I remember that. And people were building little computers out of a kit that you would order from the mail. And I was so intrigued by this. And I started experimenting a little bit. And actually, the first word processors were very cumbersome. And it was almost like writing code. And you would write a line, and there would have to be symbols you put at the end of the line, and there were all these symbols you put to start a new paragraph, and all of that. But I told you I was a techie, and so I was really intrigued by this newest technology for writing. And I still remember, and I remember the place, and I still remember the time when I decided that I was not going to write on paper anymore. I was not going to write. Before that time, I'd actually written all my papers in longhand, and I'd cut and pasted, so I'd have taped papers, taped yellow legal pads, where I would reorganize things and so on, and I'd done all my papers that way, and I'd had a semi-successful career as a grad student and undergrad, and I'd learned how to write, and I did pretty well in my writing classes. But there was this moment where I said, I'm going to do it online, and I did it online. I wrote a whole paper. I still remember. I remember the title of that paper. It was a really important piece for me. It was actually about the teaching of writing, and the title of it was Acts of Wonderment. Now, isn't that a good title?
I think so.
Acts of Wonderment. And it was about the students I was teaching, and it was actually about their writing process. And so I had an opportunity to publish this piece as a book chapter, and I remember sitting down, and I remember, you're making me remember all of these things, Jonathan, and gee whiz, who knew? I remember writing at night, and this time in an office in a building called the Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh. And I remember writing that piece on a word processor for the very first time. And after that, I never looked back. I never did another paper on paper, not ever.
Wow. Do you keep a journal?
I used to. You're making me feel guilty. I feel as if I should keep a journal. Well, I take that back. I start a lot of journals.
Okay.
And but I just don't keep them up. And I think there's a reason for that. I start journaling out of a big need for something, a need to put ideas down on paper or on the screen, and it's this palpable felt need. It was the same at the Astrodome. It's the same at different times as a writer. And once those ideas, once they're there, and once the problem is solved, once I've externalized this thing that I'm working on, once I've given words to the idea and I've created an artifact with them there, I don't need to do it anymore. I don't need to do the journaling anymore. But I'm feeling so guilty now you said that. I think I should journal.
Well, maybe a journal doesn't have to be a book with a lock on it and a diary. I mean, a journal can be a place where you collect your ideas. Do you have some sort of system before you're ready to jump into whether it's a narrative or writing a research piece that you do this sort of a sandbox?
Yeah. Well, I used to keep. And I still have them, these little notebooks. I don't know if you all keep little notebooks. I like different shapes and sizes and colors, and I like these little bound notebooks. And typically in the past, now, when I start a project, I buy a fresh little book, and I start to write at the beginning of it. And you know what I do sometimes is, I copy down other people's writing. I copy down sentences that I admire. Mm-hmm. And I always read in order to start writing, and invariably, I try to read something that I find really compelling. It doesn't exactly have to be about the topic of what I'm writing about, but it has to be compelling, and the language has to be beautiful. It has to be aesthetically pleasing, and it has to be powerful. I read those things, and then the words and phrases that speak to me, I copy down in my little book. And eventually, I get a whole list of sentences, and then the next step for me, and sometimes I do this on the screen too, but the next step for me is making a list of those things and putting it at the beginning of a document, and then looking at them, reading through them, taking one, making it my first sentence, and so on. But I tell my students this too. It's not as if you remember when you were required to write outlines? God, I hated writing outlines, Roman numeral 1, A, little number 1. I hated doing that. But there's a power in a list. I remember reading in literacy theory how powerful it was to have the technology of list making. Think what you can do with a list that you can't do without it. So there's this power of a list of ideas that you have in front of you that you can take from, reorganize, meld, reshape, and that's how my writing gets started.
Ray Bradbury talked about making a list of nouns. He would just random nouns, and he would collect them, and from that would emerge, as we know, he was fairly prolific.
Yeah.
These stories would, but he didn't know how it worked, but just, he'd say, the car, the building, the sun, the ball, and then out of that, I guess it was a little bit of his unconscious working at the time. But I'm with you on the Roman numeral outlines. But do you have any techniques, any recommendations, or from your process in the list making, it's not a random list, how to go about organizing that? Because I think a lot of students they either know the Roman numeral and they just find that stultifying, but they're not really sure how to get started in terms of organization.
Yeah, I do have a few ideas about that. And I'm a word person, but I'm also a visual person, and when I'm writing, I kind of like to imagine the length of segments of a piece. And I do this with my students too. When I'm teaching how to do a research paper, for example, and I list out the parts, and I say to students, imagine an intro. Imagine your intro on the page, and it's going to be a half a page. It's going to be a paragraph. And then imagine this next section that's going to follow it. And then imagine the conclusion. And for me, a conclusion is one of my difficult parts. It's going to at least be a half a page, not much more than that. So I try, and I draw this sometimes. I draw it out on a whiteboard, and then I begin to move ideas into those units, those visual kinds of units. And I try not to get too stressed about organization. I know that there needs to be organization, but you can't figure that out until you know what your ideas are and what the progression of the ideas are. So one of the things that's important for me in thinking about this visual of a paper, it makes me think about the arc of that paper, the argument of that paper, how the ideas are going to move in that paper from here to here to here to here. And the longer the paper gets, the more sections I have to have in order to imagine that arc. It's very, very difficult to imagine the arc of an argument in a 20-page paper. But you can imagine the arc of an argument in a 3-page paper. And so I divide things up into segments and work within those segments. But I try to be very plastic about it, very flexible about it, and not rigid at all in terms of an organization.
I love that idea of visualizing it, because I think that we can just get paralyzed by, okay, I have 5 words, what are my next 5 words, and not have a concept of what the bigger picture is.
Yeah.
So that frees you up so that you don't even have to think about words. It's just, okay, this is going to happen here and this is going to happen here.
Yeah, and you made me think of one other thing about this process of trying to get organized and how you make an argument flow and all of that. Once you write a paragraph, especially like if it's the beginning paragraph, you've charted your path through a paper. And that can be a good thing. It can also be a kind of barrier, because every sentence you write means that you're influencing the sentences that are going to follow. The further you get in a paper, the fewer choices you have about the next sentence that's going to come. Do you know what I mean? It's like you get caught up in the sentences that you have there on the page, and they sort of begin to dictate to you what's going to come next and next and next. And so it's really important, I have found, for my own writing process, not to commit so early that my argument, that my sentences are dictated and I get taken down the wrong path just because I wrote these sentences up here at the beginning.
Yeah. A lot of our first and second year writing students come up with their thesis, and then they have a lot of trouble getting out of that, because this is my thesis,
yes,
and I don't know what comes next. And I suggest, well, maybe let's set that thesis aside. And it's hard. It's really hard for them. It's a great thesis.
It is a great thesis. And you know what you should do? You should keep that thesis. Just put it in a different file. I've got this practice. I never throw away anything that I write. I swear, never. I figure I'm going to use those words sometime or other. And if I go down the wrong path and I have this paragraph here and it's a beautiful, damn good paragraph, but I know it's not right for this paper, I save it. I save it, I put it at the end of the file, and and it helps me, because putting words out there, it's difficult, and I don't like to waste them, and I don't like to waste the work, the energy that it took to put them there.
Do you ever come back to something that you saved, something that, or do something with it?
Not usually. So maybe it's more, of a trick than anything else. But I'll tell you, writers need tricks. Mm-hmm. You need tricks to keep going, and the more you have to make your process, really functional and to work for you, the better.
Yeah, I have trouble throwing things away. My wife will back me up on that. And I do save everything, and just in case I need it.
Just in case.
Yeah. So you said you're not a morning person.
No.
When you write, besides having a good place and having a nice weather, do you need other things? Do you need coffee, tea? Are there other things that are part of your ritual? A favorite beverage?
Clothes. Clothes are important for me when I write. I need to be comfortable, and it's not like sweatsuit comfortable, but I need to feel right in my clothes. And that sounds pretty weird, I know, but it has to. It really has to do with the way in which writing externalizes your interior thoughts, and it really has to do with this embodiment, this embodied process, this putting meaning into the world that comes from you, and for that to happen best, I actually want to be dressed in a certain way. I won't tell you how.
I'm just looking at the time. I do want to allow some time for questions from the audience, and I have so many more questions to ask you, and my students have contributed questions. But anyway, I just wanted to, if you have a question and you're thinking about it, in about 5 minutes, I will ask you. So we've talked about writing, we've talked about drafts, we've talked about process, revision. What is your revision is there a difference between your drafting process and your revision practice? Are they different habits of mind?
I think they really are. And I think I'm not a talented reviser. And I walk around my apartment and I get words in my mind, and I do my idea outline, and I do my visualization, and I stew and stew. And a lot of what I write, the best of what I write, kind of comes out fully clothed, so to speak. It's not something that I go back to, and that's what I love the most, is when I'm able to be so prepared that the writing kind of spills out of me, and I don't have to go back and revise. Of course, that doesn't happen so often, and you have to develop these practices around revision. And I'll just say it's difficult for me. I think that's the most difficult part of writing for me. It's hard to revisit your ideas, and sometimes this is kind of a funny thought I had with these dome notes that I wrote, and I sent them back to Steve Tollefson to read. As I wrote during the week, I started writing more and more and more. And Steve Tollefson told me at the time, he sent me an email and he said, "Enough already. You're getting really long-winded." And but when I went back to revise them, I found it really difficult. I found it difficult to throw away these ideas that were so important to me. And I guess what I'm saying, John, is that I don't have a very good revision process. And revision's hard, and I do it because I have to. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for confessing that. So Steve read your Astrodome pieces. For other pieces, do you have someone read your pieces? Do you have trusted readers? I mean, what's the process there after you've written something?
Oh, gee whiz, I would never send anything out into the world unless I ask someone to read it. And I always tell my students that, and that having someone read your pieces it's not cheating. It's just smart. It's part of being a writer, is to get somebody to read your work. And you know what? Part of getting to read somebody else's work, what a privilege. What a privilege you experience when somebody else engages with your words on the page. I count that such an honor and a privilege.
Yeah. Do you read other people's work, and do you have a technique or a way of giving other people feedback?
Yeah, I do. And even for this piece, for this little excerpt I read today, I had to go back, and it was so difficult for me to cut. It was the note was so long, and I just got all twisted around in it. And what did I do? I asked my colleague Erin Murphy-Graham, who's here or was here. Are you still here, Erin? I think she's gone. You have to tell her I gave a shout out to her. I asked her to read it, and she gave me feedback, and it was so helpful to me just to know how to cut, where things seemed off the mark, how this was likely to hit people. In terms of how I give feedback, I always I always give feedback first on ideas and only later in the writing process on sentences. So if a student brings me a paper, I'm likely not to write on it or make marks on it at all. I'm likely instead to record something or to sit and talk about it and say, man, I'm liking what you're doing here. I like this paragraph, and where were you going here? And so it's this focus on ideas at the beginning. And then after that, you know what I really love to do as a teacher is when you've got a good draft and somebody's put in a good effort to have a good draft, is to tinker with those sentences and to try out this word and say, keep it or leave it. I usually say keep it or leave it, but I think about another word here. And I used to comment actually on papers. I'd print them out and I would comment on them by hand. And then I realized that people couldn't read my handwriting, and I had this habit of putting nice everywhere, and nice and nice and nice, and students would come to me and say, what is this? And I realized I was causing them trauma because my handwriting was so poor. Yeah, but there's this point where, as a teacher of writing, I love to interact with someone else's language and to work on making the phrase perfect, and to celebrating what's there on the page, and to say, gee, golly, wow, I wish I'd written that sentence.
When asked how to become a good writer, when young writers ask more experienced writers how to become a good writer, often the advice is read a lot, which I will confess I have problems with that because, I agree that it's important to read, but if someone's trying to write, and if you're telling them, well, just go read, read all of the great works, well, okay. Do you subscribe to that advice?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Okay.
I subscribe to read. If you can't write, read. Or if you're having trouble on your writing process, do read. But choose something pretty wonderful to read. Choose a piece you really admire. And another thing I tell students is, as undergraduates and as graduate students, seek out writing that you really admire, and commit it to yourself. Practice those sentences. Try out the syntax of a writer's that you really admire. I think it's important, and Ramona was saying that I'd done some work on multimodality as some of my research, and I think writing using images and creating multimodal text, creating multilingual text, all of these things are ways to get writing started and for it to flourish. And I'd want people to seek out these various paths to writing and to figure out this whole bag of methods and practices that you can draw on when you need to.
So my last question before we go to the Q&A is, and this is the only place we can go, what do you read? Or what are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading my students' papers. Right now, I am reading The Most Brilliant Dissertation. Where are you, Meg? Right now, I'm reading a piece by, another brilliant dissertation by a student who's living now in Singapore. And he's writing a dissertation about Bitcoin and all kinds of things I don't know anything about. And engaging, just like we were talking before, with the ideas of others, especially when students. It's the coolest thing to read.
I agree. That's my favorite part of the job is I'm going to be reading research papers
Exactly.
and things that I get to learn about that other students have done the work on.
I have to tell you, may I?
Please.
Getting carried away here. But last week, my Ed 140 students turned in their midterm, which was what we call a multimodal literacy autobiography. It's a story of becoming literate or learning a language. And the only requirement for doing this assignment is that you can't write an essay alone. It has to be multimodal. You have to use other modes. And I encourage people to be creative, to try things they haven't tried in the past, and to let their creativity really flow. And I want to tell you, oh my goodness, we get the most marvelous artifacts, breathtaking, things I could never do. I aspire to these artifacts, to being able to communicate multimodally in ways that never even occurred to me. Layering image on text, switching languages, switching material artifacts, coming up with ways of making meaning that are distinctive and unique. And lucky me, I get to read these. I get to view them.
So now I'd like to open it up to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and it can be about anything. Yes?
Hi, yeah, I have a question about kind of developing my identity as a writer. So growing up, kind of like in school, I was always perceiving myself as a STEM student. I kind of feel like I felt this like stereotypical ideal of just smart something. I mean, like, I would go to writing classes. It's not that I hated it, but it's like writing's not my thing. It's doing this all. I think the great part about creative is I've seen so many different cultures, and I've started to kind of like following into my voice. But I'm still struggling accepting myself as a writer and kind of coming into that identity that I can be someone who can write strong pieces.
Yeah.
So we probably need to repeat that question or the gist of it before, just because it wasn't mic'd. So it was about the writer's identity.
Yes, and thank you for that question. And I've met other STEM students at Berkeley who are facing the same issue, who are identified as talented STEM students, but who are thought not to be writers. There's a story about Amy Tan, who went to Berkeley and who was encouraged by her parents to go towards STEM and not as an Asian American to go toward writing. And you know who Amy Tan is, and you know what she's written, The Joy Luck Club, and so many other novels. And she claimed that identity as a writer, and she insisted on having it. One of the things that I see in my classes is I see students take up the identity of a writer when they have more options about what to write. Just as I was talking about before, the multimodal literacy autobiography, one of my former students who was in STEM did the most amazing video that he narrated. And he narrated the story about having multiple selves as a STEM student, but also as a musician and as a writer. And it was just this staggeringly moving piece where he allowed his identity as a writer to come forth in these different modalities. And so sometimes I think finding the mode that works for you, whether it's just words or it's image and words, or whether it's a podcast or whether it's videos, I think that sometimes opens up one's writing identity. So if you will, I have permission from this wonderful student in the past to share his multimodal literacy autobiography as a STEM student who writes. I'll share it with you. Yeah?
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes.
I have a question about audience. I really love writing for children, and I've been doing it for quite a while in different media. I was a preschool storytime reader for a long time, and it changed my life. I'm at a point in my career now where I really need to be writing more for adults, and I don't like them. I'm in 140, and I just did the multimodal project, and I did it as like a picture book, like I would read at storytime. And Jonathan Perez is the GSI is fantastic. I did a little sample of it, and he said, "This is great. You have to put the quotes in, even though they wouldn't go into a picture book." And I was like, "Oh right,
Yeah.
How do you have advice about how to get that enthusiasm to engage with different audiences? In my case, how to engage with like grown-ups in the same way as you engage with the people, the audience that you love and care about and want to read. Because in writing, like you don't always get to choose who it is that you're talking to.
So the question is about
Yeah.
audience and how do you engage with a given audience when it's not necessarily your ideal audience?
Oh, it's such a great question, and shout out to 140 and Jonathan Perez. Yes. Anytime we write anything, it's for an audience, and anytime, even when we speak, it's for an audience, and what we write or speak is being shaped by what we imagine that audience to be. There's a word for it by the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, whom you also read in 140, yeah? Shaping at the point of utterance, that is addressing an audience. And so it's so hugely important to feel somehow that your audience is worthy of you, that it's an audience that you want to give yourself to. So my only advice for you, and I'd love it if the writing teachers in the room would actually help me out here, is to imagine an adult audience that you do like, to imagine actual people that you would write to. Because if you're writing to an audience that you do not like, I can't even imagine doing it, because you're so being shaped by your expectation of how they will respond. So somehow you got to flip the script there and create this audience to write to that consists of people that you admire or at least tolerate. Yes, Mara.
I was just going to say, I was at a writing workshop last weekend from the Bay Area Writing Project, and the focus of it was on audience, and the suggestion was actually the person facilitating created on AI an audience member. So was like, I want this person to be a parent of an X-year-old student in Oakland Unified. Their background is blah, blah, blah. They like doing this and that and blah, blah. And then that person, the prompts then in AI were to please review this work through the lens of this, gave the person a name. So maybe you could try creating an audience member you do like with AI.
Wow. So
Cool,
back
Mara.
to the utility of AI. So yes, we come full circle.
Shout out to the Bay Area Writing Project.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes, thank you.
Dixon Lamb.
We are actually at time. I want to thank you, Glynda Hull, for spending some time with us. It's been lovely. And thank you once again to the Morrison Library for hosting this event. And we'll see you next year.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.